Hi, everyone. My name is Maria, and I work here at Google in a product excellence team. And thank you for joining us today in person and over live stream. It's great to see interest in design at Google. And I'd also like to thank my co-organizers, Sergey and Maurice, for making this happen, as well as the Talks at Google team here. So today we're excited to welcome Dr. Barry Katz, who's going to talk about the history of design of the Silicon Valley. Barry has 5 different jobs. He is a fellow at IDEO. He's also a professor of industrial and interaction design at the California College of the Arts in San Francisco. He's a consulting professor in the design group, Department of Mechanical Engineering at Stanford. He's also an innovation consultant to governments and companies around the world, and he's a book author.
That's 5.
That's 5. I said 5, yep. And today he's here to talk about the history of design in the Silicon Valley, the topic of his latest book. And I've been lucky to be Barry's student, and I think that we're here up for a really great talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. So I think I need the microphone for the remote people. Google is like this huge vacuum cleaner that's sucking up talent from all around the Bay Area and the world. So it's been a real pleasure to see so many of my former colleagues, students, friends, old friends, new friends from all 5 of those reference points that Maria referred to. And it's true, I do all of those things, and I have a lot of lunches on Caltrain. Which, as you know, does not have a restaurant, but I'm moving around a lot. Now, what I would like to talk about with you is the formation of a design profession in Silicon Valley. And I thought I would start with a little bit of self-promotional advertising, so forget that. But I did just publish a book, Make It New, which is derived from an exhortation of the poet Ezra Pound in 1934, when he delivered this manifesto under the title Make It New, in which he called for a revival of our culture. And that kind of seemed like what's like an appropriate way to think about design in Silicon Valley, which I think has been a neglected, curiously neglected part of the story of the success of the Valley. So here's the proof. What you've got on the that image on the right is a page out of the 1979 Palo Alto phone book. And it lists in that red perimeter every one of the design consultancies in Northern California, all 9 of them, including one called Hovey Kelly Design, which is the only one that still exists, although it's changed its name a few times and is now known as IDEO. But there they are, all of the designers in Silicon Valley, squeezed between detective agencies and diaper services. And there's not a whole lot. So when I became very curious about how we have moved from this situation in which we were absolutely not on the map to where we are today. And I'm going to be arguing that there are probably more design professionals working within 50 miles of where you're all sitting right now than anywhere else in the world. And that happened in about 30, 35 years. So I became very curious about that phenomenon. This is the first of a series of stupid maps with logos all over them that you're going to see, so I apologize for that. But it is, of course, our beloved Bay Area. Those are the 2 earthquake faults, which make it a kind of a fragile place. My students refer to them as my fault and your fault. And what you're seeing in the logos are a selection of some of the design consultancies that operate in the Valley. The original ones, which still exist, Lunar, IDEO, and Frog, all founded around 1980. And then they began to calve off a 2nd generation and a 3rd generation, and now already a 4th generation of smaller firms that are spilling out. such that today there are, as I think I can probably argue convincingly, more designers working in this area than anywhere else in the world. And part of the reason that that is just so striking is if you had asked almost anybody in about, let's say, 1980, when this activity began to ratchet up, what are the design capitals of the world? I think there would have been a really easy consensus, and you should disagree with me if this doesn't sound about right, but it would have been London for product design, and New York for graphics, and Paris for fashion, Milan for furniture, Tokyo for electronics, Los Angeles for whatever they do down there. And if you had said, and the San Francisco Bay Area, I think you would have been met with a blank stare. There was virtually nothing that distinguished the area in terms of design, and now we find ourselves as the global epicenter of professional practice. The second piece of it is, in addition to the independent design consultancies, the IDEOs, the Frogs, the Lunars, and their second, third, and fourth generation offspring, practically every one of the iconic companies of the Valley has built a significant internal design group. So you've got about 200 and some design professionals working at Google. There are about 180 UX designers working at Uber. Pinterest has about 40. Quora has its team. And we're starting to see, ominously for some, the arrival of Chinese companies. Alibaba has a design group, Apple's iconic industrial design studio, and so on and so forth. The result of which is, as I say, the beginnings of, not the beginnings, but we are well into the building of a critical mass of independent consultancies plus product-oriented companies with their own very significant design populations. And then the third piece of it, this is not precisely a Silicon Valley story, but in a sense it is. We are starting to see the building of internal design groups or design thinking groups, which is not quite the same thing, showing up in companies that have no, and organizations, not just companies, that have no particular tradition of being product-oriented or having any kind of a design sensibility. So what's going on when, within the last 3 to 5 years, Kleiner Perkins announces that they have appointed John Maeda, former president of RISD, as its first design partner. Or when, what else? We've got McKinsey, which is, I think, an $8 billion management consultancy, buying Lunar Design whole, acquiring this design competence. And I could repeat those kinds of stories. Capital One acquiring Adaptive Path, this wave of mergers, acquisitions of by large organizations of design companies in order to build an internal design competence. And it's actually quite amazing. The U.S. Army has gotten addicted to design thinking. God help us. I don't know where that's going to take us. What a prototype of a war might look like. And I will tell you one quick story because I really love this one. About a year ago, McKinsey threw a big party for 100 of its top corporate clients to show off the new acquisition that it acquired, Lunar Design, a very distinguished engineering plus design organization based in San Francisco, about 70 people. And they had asked me to MC the event, and as I introduced each of the McKinsey guys, who are the architects of the deal, they all got up in front of the audience and made a big deal out of the fact that I'm wearing jeans. I never thought I would be wearing jeans, but we're so cool now, we're hanging with designers. And then I looked over at my 3 friends from Lunar Design, and they were all wearing suits. Like, we can play with grown-ups. There's nothing to be afraid of. We're not going to hurt you. So we've got this critical mass building up. These are, of course, not exclusively Silicon Valley firms, but they testify to the explosion of interest in a design practice and a design mentality that absolutely does have its roots here. So this led me to a series of questions that I set out to answer in the book. And assuming that nobody in this room can read, They are, number one, how did the Bay Area move from relative obscurity to become what I think is the global epicenter of professional design practice in the world today? Secondly, how did design move from a marginal service in which designers are basically pleading for an office, for an audience with some engineering manager somewhere, to becoming a strategic driver of some of the world's most important companies? And I'm thinking about the week that Larry Page became CEO of Google and announced the launch of Project Kennedy here. In the past, he said, this is not me, this is your boss, Google has been driven by engineering and analytics. In the future, it will be driven by design. I think many people in this room are still waiting to see that happen, but it's beginning. And an acknowledgement from the top is a fairly extraordinary thing. So how did design move from being a marginal service in which designers were trying hard to convince somebody in upper management or in engineering teams that they had a value to add and they weren't simply cute, to the increasingly important role they are playing across the spectrum? And then third, how did professional practice evolve? So to be a designer in the earliest stages of this story, which I'll get to in a moment, meant probably you were packaging electronic components in sheet metal enclosures. And if this is a design audience, how many of you guys are doing that? That's not what it looks like any longer. There are probably still some. But we now have this amazing phenomenon of designers working on some of the thorniest, most wicked, intractable problems of human civilization today. So designers working on global poverty as a design issue, on urban violence as a design issue, on pediatric obesity, access to maternal health facilities as design problems. Very, very different. How did that evolution take place? So what I'll do in a few minutes now is tell you a bit about how I formulated my answers to these questions in a project that took me about 6 years, and I have to say it was a total labor of love. I enjoyed it hugely. Interviewed about 200 people. Normally my research strategy was I would find myself in conversation with one of the important figures in this story. The last question was, so what's in your garage? Oh, boxes. What's in the boxes? Papers. What kind of papers? I don't know. I haven't looked at the goddamn things in 30 years. And then I'm 6 weeks in Larry Tesler's garage in Portola Valley looking through all of this stuff. In any case, the book is based almost entirely on first-person original primary source research, and the stuff is there, and it just required a lot of digging, and was loads of fun to do. Okay, so I would like to tell you a kind of a synopsis of some of my findings, organized around a particular one particular story out of the large number. So I spent time looking at the technology companies, of course. The origins of design do not start with Apple and Steve Jobs. That's the ghost of Steve Jobs rising above the new Apple campus. But it goes back much further, so I spent lots of time looking at the tech companies, the academic environment of the Bay Area is extremely important. So I studied the nature of design training, how we design designers in the engineering environment of Stanford, the art school environment of California College of the Arts, and in a public university setting at San Jose State, each of which was critically important in its own way. Looked at the labs, which played a very, very important role, from Stanford Research Institute, now SRI International, to the famous Xerox PARC, Atari Research Labs. Those drug-besotted hippies down there were a major piece of the story, and up to interval research. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. But it was all a real eye-opening experience for me, partly because my beginning assumption was that design in Silicon Valley began when Steve Jobs began to hire the group that became IDEO and Frog Design and Lunar, and it turned out that that is the midpoint of the story, not the origins. That was, to use our favorite word, the pivot. So for the origins, we need to go back to two iconic companies. Hewlett-Packard is still very much with us. Almost the only thing left of Ampex is that sign, which you will see as you're riding the Google bus back up to Noe Valley. They're missing a P, and I always think that American Express stole the P to get some free advertising. And it looks something like this. August 1st, 1951, a guy named Carl Clement drove down from Washington State with his freshly minted University of Washington industrial design degree, looked up an old college roommate who was working for a 250-person instrument firm in Palo Alto, some of you may have heard of, called Hewlett-Packard. On a whim, he interviewed for a job. He showed his airbrushed portfolio full of, automotive interiors and desk lamps and things. The engineering manager, an applied physicist named Ralph Lee, looked over his stuff and said, "It's very nice, but we don't do that here." But they gave him a job nonetheless because one day it was noticed that the insignias on the HP packing crates blended into the background and were not visible, and they had the idea that this guy, who's a designer, whatever the hell that meant, might be able to help improve the graphics. So the result, and that is the first designer 1.0 of Silicon Valley, the result was to get rid of the beige cardboard background, make it white so that the HP logo would pop. David Packard was driving behind an HP truck one day that didn't have its rear door down, and he saw it and he said, "That's really great," and design begins in the valley. That is Bill Hewlett. That is David Packard. I like to say that Hewlett is standing up because Packard really was about 18 feet tall. So the story begins very much as a kind of a branding story, which in itself is not that interesting. I have this great quote in which as the design group, which was one person, tried increasingly to gain a hearing within the engineering environment of HP, they let him in with the instruction, "You irritate my engineers, you're out of here." In time, the design group increased by orders of magnitude. It went from one person to two, and from two people to four, and swelled within a decade to a total of 6 people, this sprawling design enterprise. And they moved from rather trivial projects of the sort that I just said, improving graphics on cardboard boxes, to the idea that we can establish a coherent design language. This is actually, in a way, an anticipation of what Project Kennedy did at Google when he set out to integrate Maps and Search and Gmail and the other products in the platform and give them a kind of a family coherence. So at the time of this second phase of design at HP, the HP catalog listed something like 373 devices. Each one of them was a discrete, self-standing entity. They would have been enclosed in mahogany boxes, in aluminum, with mitered edges, sometimes in no enclosures at all. They were simply not, that was not on the radar screen as part of the offering of a company. And the proposal was made by the internal design group that we can establish a coherent language that would help engineers to identify an HP product anywhere they saw it. And these were beloved instruments in the technical community across the US. So this was actually a fairly significant thing, and you can see the results of that after several years, that there is definitely a family resemblance among their products. But I want to move to the third phase of this, because what we're actually seeing is the formation of a new concept of professional design practice, which will lead in a straight line to where we are today. Phase 3, Phase 1 was cardboard boxes and graphics on them. Phase 2 was a consistent design language. Phase 3 was the suggestion that I hope will resonate with some of you in design at Google, which is that design can actually improve the performance of a product, not just make it look good and not just make a statement to the external world. And that happened when a new guy took over with the idea that we're going to embed ourselves in the various divisions of Hewlett-Packard, oscilloscopes, microwaves, and so on. And what he did, his name was Alan Inhelder, and he left us just about a year ago. But I was able to spend a bunch of time with him in his retreat up in Portola Valley. And he told me the story of how as he attempted to establish credibility within this insanely engineering-driven environment, you may hear some resonances of your experience here, he took Hewlett-Packard's single best-selling product, HP Model 608 VHF signal generator, and made a facsimile of the faceplate of it on a piece of cardboard, which he then overlaid with those pieces of colored masking tape. That's all you're seeing there. And his point, as he presented it to a very, very skeptical group of electrical engineers, was that the design, or the lack of design of the product, it was completely irrational. It was completely arbitrary. It was almost literally as if the internal workings of the product had been established and then somebody poked holes in the faceplate to accommodate the controls for attenuation, frequency modulation, and whatever. And with a little bit of forethought and a little bit of analysis, it could be reconfigured. It was called in those days a related function and control link analysis, that if there were a clear visual connection between turning the thing on, controlling it, and reading out the display, it could be easier to use, faster to use, perhaps even safer to use. We could perhaps take up less space, scarce real estate on an engineer's bench, and so on and so forth. The engineers listened to him with their skepticism beginning to melt away. There was a silence when he finished his presentation, and then they gave him a standing ovation, and design was established at Hewlett-Packard. So that's a beginning story, and that goes back way, way before Apple began to put design so prominently in the world's consciousness. That was back in the 50s and into the 60s. But for most of the period, this is what design was. It was people such as Harold Lindsay, chief engineer at Ampex, which invented magnetic recording. Actually, they stole it from the Nazis, but they commercialized magnetic recording. Harold Lindsay, the iconic embodiment of what I'd call the engineer with taste. Nothing went out of Ampex's studios that didn't have his kind of fastidious attention to detail. And over about a decade, the model of the engineer with taste evolved into that of the professionally trained designer. That's a guy named Frank Walsh, who was the first manager of industrial design at the Ampex Corporation, which again basically no longer exists, with his friend, whose name is Elmer Average, an articulated anthropometric figure, in which they're approaching the task of design in an, I'd say, almost rigorously scientific fashion, not just kind of how it looks and how it feels and is it beautiful or not. So it's starting to happen. We are starting to get a professionalization of design at the two big companies, Hewlett-Packard and Ampex, and then a small number of little operations that are scattered around the Bay Area doing calculating machines and such. The main characteristic of design for most of this period, for all of this period thus far, is that it was strictly within a very technology-intensive and what we would call business-to-business environment, which they stayed as far away from the consumer market as possible. The reason is probably contained in this story. If any of you have parents who worked in engineering in the Valley or anywhere else for that matter, in the 1970s. Just show them a picture of the HP 35 calculator, and your father, it'll probably be your father, will start to cry. Oh, this was the beloved instrument. This is the iPhone of the 1970s. And it's a very, very good story of why designers remained confined to this very technology-intensive environment and those sorts of products. So what happened here, and I'll tell this story very quickly, but it's a good one. In 1971, Bill Hewlett conceived the idea of investing $1 million, and in those days $1 million was real money. It was not like down payment on a doghouse in Los Altos. He conceived the idea of investing $1 million in replacing Hewlett-Packard's very, very successful desktop calculator with a portable device that an engineer could stick into his shirt pocket obviously, and take out into the field as a surveyor, as a mining engineer, perhaps as an airplane pilot, perhaps as a surgeon into an operating room, any kind of professional environment. He had to overcome significant resistance from his business office, from his engineering people, but you know, he was the boss, so he had his way, and I would say fortunately. But here is the thing about it. In all previous tech products at Hewlett-Packard and pretty much elsewhere, the brief would have begun with technical specifications. And it would have been something like, build a machine that will execute transcendental functions using a pseudo-multiplication algorithm and displayed in reverse Polish notation. And I have absolutely no idea what I just said. But, and then it would be handed over to the design group to put it in a box. And in this case, the sequence was completely reversed. So the starting point was rather, and I'm quoting Hewlett right now, give me, quote, a shirt pocket-sized scientific calculator with 4-hour operation from rechargeable batteries at a cost that any laboratory and many individuals could easily justify. Not a technical criterion in there. So it was, in a sense, start with the design and then give me the suitable engineering innards of the thing. So it was a landmark product. They estimated that they would probably sell, I think, 500 of them over the first year. In the first year, it was just a complete runaway blockbuster success, amounted to 40% of Hewlett-Packard's profits. So it sent the message, it just telegraphed this powerful message: design matters. Design can actually be a critical driver of a product and not simply an aesthetic afterthought. Unfortunately, it went to their heads. They got the idea, we can do anything. We were on the cusp of a new age of miniaturization. What else can we do? And it's not just Hewlett-Packard, but Intel as well. So Hewlett-Packard says the next stage after a calculator, let's put it on your wrist. And we're talking wearables now in the early 1970s. So they created this absolutely hideous marvel of miniaturization. The HP One watch calculator whose buttons had to be pressed by a little stylus that was buried in the watch band that you instantly lost or used as a toothpick until it became disgusting. Engineers loved it, but it was kind of a dumb thing. Gordon Moore, similar idea over at Intel, more of Moore's Law, that we have mastered miniaturization. We can put 50,000 transistors on a chip. My God, what else can we do with our technical savvy? Let's make a watch. So they created what I am pretty sure is the ugliest wristwatch ever created. Gordon Moore wore the Intel Microma on his deathbed. He referred to it as his $15 million watch, because that's how much money the company lost on it. As a reminder, never to go anywhere near the consumer market. So they understood tech, they understood the business environment, they understood the engineering, and they didn't understand anything about the vagaries of consumer behavior. That's terra incognita, that's death. There was only one exception that I can think of a tech firm in the region venturing over that forbidden boundary separating the professional engineering world and the consumer market, and that is, of course, Atari. How many of you have played Pong? All of you? Any of you? Yeah. So I lost a very large number of quarters in Pong machines when I was in graduate school in Santa Cruz years ago. But it was pretty much the only tech product that I can think of from the first 30 years of the growth of this region as a tech center that was commercially interesting and commercially successful. And in fact, Atari was, for a time, the fastest growing and most drug-infused company in the United States. For most people, however, design in California meant either Grateful Dead posters or, the Sunset Magazine image of Northern California lifestyle, Eichler houses, glassy atriums and that kind of thing, maybe a little bit of Eames-era furniture. But as I said at the beginning, if you thought about the major centers of design anywhere in the world, we were simply not on the map. And it began to change from very unexpected quarters. And I will explain that just through one example out of a very large number, some of which are discussed in the book. And it starts here. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the migration of personal computing out of the laboratory environments of what was then called the Stanford Research Institute and toward the market. But let me tell it to you rather briefly from a design perspective, which is something that I was able to get into and surprisingly seem not to have been discussed elsewhere. So here is the famous Douglas Engelbart, the inventor of the workstation. And we know all about Douglas Engelbart and the 1968 presentation at the San Francisco Joint Computer Conference in which he demonstrated remote collaboration through an interactive computer experience. What was not known is that one of Engelbart's best friends in this critical period in which he is exploring the computer not as a calculating machine, but as an interactive information and communications machine. He made friends with a guy named Robert Probst, who was the director of the Herman Miller Research Institute, Herman Miller Office Furniture, a design-driven office furniture company, still very much with us and very much design-driven in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Probst always thought of himself more as a philosopher than as a furniture designer, and he had become interested in the changing patterns of work as we faced a situation of what everybody now calls information overload or the information tsunami. So he got into the practice of looking at what IDEO people like to call the extreme users. He had different language for it, but that was people who lived in a world of hyper-information. And he found his way to Douglas Engelbart's lab, the Augmentation Research Institute at Stanford Research Center, where they were developing the first online system. So we have the inventor of the cubicle, called the Action Office, for which he apologized later in his life, by the way, making friends with the inventor of the workstation in a really historic collaboration of design and engineering. So Engelbart is sitting there with, I'm afraid you can't make it out very well, but it's a plastic tray that's something like what you would see in a baby's high chair, which has 3 reservoirs in it, one containing a keyboard that was cannibalized off of an IBM Selectric typewriter, another a device called an XY position indicator, which you better know as a mouse, and a third is a 5-fingered key set. They called it a chord set, through which by pressing the keys in any combination you could get the first one an A, a B, a C, a D, 2 together, E, F, the full alphanumeric keyboard. And Engelbart, too, on his deathbed, was convinced that that was a faster way to input data into a computer than the mouse. In any case, it was the designers from Herman Miller who helped Engelbart actually to fashion the program. So there we have the first prototype of an interactive computing experience which is about communication and getting your work done, and not simply about performing, feeding in rolls of paper tape in the punched cards in the morning and pulling out rolls of paper tape in the afternoon. He also, interestingly enough, built a computer with a display on it, which was highly, highly unusual in the 1960s. It would be like putting a plexiglass hood on your car so that you could see the engine. Why would anybody want to see what's going on inside the computer? You put in your cards, you pulled out your tape, but for Engelbart, it's an interactive experience, and the whole point is that you are interacting in a behavioral, experiential way. Okay, so we pretty much know the story. Engelbart was a bit of a nut when the Xerox Corporation put $100 million into opening a new research center on Coyote Hill Road in Palo Alto. A bunch of Engelbart's top scientists and engineers migrated over to Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, where they proceeded to build a working, functional prototype of an interactive desktop, or in the words of Alan Kay, personal computer. From a design, this is pretty well known, there are gobs of books about it, but I wanted to get into the design element of it. And that proved to be a very, very interesting story. They brought a designer, an industrial designer, actually the same guy who had created the design group at Hewlett-Packard, to help them figure out what a personal desktop computer experience might physically look like. Here are some pages from on the right from his notebook, and on the left, this is Larry Tesler, who was one of the chief scientists at Google, at Xerox, who then went to Apple, playing around conceptually with what some of these devices might look like. So that's the mouse, which he's imagining as a 3-button thing, almost like Morse code, dot dash, and if you get frustrated, damn it, and that's your emergency thing. The reason I love these images, and that's that 5-fingered key set thing. The reason I love these images is that for much of design's history, what designers were doing is taking an existing product and improving it. So you've got this year's toaster looks like this, so next year's toaster is going to look like this. But if next year's toaster looks like this, the year after it's got to look like this with a little bit of vinyl applique on it or something. What was starting to happen here is people, designers, were being challenged not simply to improve an existing product, but to give form to the experience of using something entirely new. And that is going to be the signature, in a sense, of what became distinctive about Silicon Valley. There is no predecessor, there is no ancestor, there is no way of looking backward to the previous model of a mouse or of a desktop personal computer. There are a couple of images pilfered from the web, so I'm not going to linger over them, of what the Xerox Alto looked like in the early 1970s. The industrial designer Clement creates a keyboard, which is, he used the term garageable into the base to save space on the desktop. And they were fond of bringing faculty brats from Stanford in to experiment with a computer that should be accessible even to kids. It's not about knowing how the computer works, what's under the keyboard or behind the screen. It's about getting your work done. Now then the story is a kind of a familiar one, which can be sort of summarized here. The Xerox Corporation, of course, determined that they were in the business of copy machines and not computing. There was not much future for personal computing. So the core of the Xerox technical community proceeded to leave in indignation or despair or whatever. Larry Tesler brings the GUI experience to the new Apple computer. Two of the chief guys left to create a digital formatting for visual design at Adobe, Geschke and Warnock. the networking protocol created at Xerox PARC. I mean, they invented everything and proceeded to lose it. Went to 3Com. Electronic Arts is a direct descendant. I'm sorry for the stupid graphics. I couldn't resist. The first laptop computer was done by Grid Systems, a guy named John Ellenby. Charles Simoni left Xerox to head up to bring his word processing protocols, which was rebooted as Microsoft Word. And it's a little bit unfair to say that Xerox PARC disappeared. It's still there, and it's a very distinguished, important laboratory. But they watched in dismay as one after another of the components of their system became implanted in some of the most successful companies of the Valley today. This is finally where Apple enters the picture, and the computer that you're seeing here is the Apple II, which is not much to look at in some ways, but I actually think is probably the single most important artifact from a design point of view in this entire history. And it's simply for this reason. Jobs had the idea that for every hardware enthusiast who wanted to buy a kit and solder together a board and build usually his own computer, there were 1,000 software enthusiasts out there who simply wanted to take it out of the box, plug it in, put a monitor on top of it, and get to work. So they made a gamble in 1977 of selling a computer in a sealed case. And I know that doesn't sound like much, but I actually think that that decision is pretty close to the seminal turning point that began to pivot design from a strictly technology environment and toward the consumer market. Because as soon as they raised that question of selling a computer that only a trained professional could or would be interested in opening up, then every other question of design followed. What should that case look like? How approachable should it be? What connection should it make visually and experientially to every other thing on your desktop, and so on and so forth. And it began the entire process of expanding the perimeter around what we consider design to be. And of course, to do that, he begins to tap into this emerging community of many Stanford graduates who are setting up 1-, 2-, and 3-person design firms up and down University Avenue. Knocks on the door of one guy, Jerry Manick, and said, "Can you create the case for the Apple II?" Manick said, "I can do it, but you got to pay me in advance." This was the third try that Jobs had made. I personally know 3 other people that turned him down on the spot, and they're still kicking themselves. I mean, would you invest a lot of your time, like $1,800 worth of free time, in a startup founded on April Fool's Day, 1976, and named after a piece of fruit? So that was the environment. But a couple of people were willing. David Kelly's group of half a dozen Stanford graduates above Roxy's dress shop on University Avenue took on the problem of a mouse. Jobs said, "Can you, I saw this device at Xerox PARC. It cost $400 to make. The mouse had to be disassembled at the end of each day, every component cleaned and then reassembled so that it could be used the next day by the researchers." Jobs said, "Can you make one that will cost $20 that I can use on my jeans and that doesn't require that kind of maintenance? Think of it not as an instrument but an appliance." And they looked at each other. "Of course we can do a mouse." And so they signed the contract, and Jobs left. And somebody said, "Does anybody know what a mouse is?" It was very much capturing what's beginning to happen at that critical period. And then it is very much an Apple-dominated story. Apple is becoming internationally notorious, partly for its design, and the decision is made by Jobs himself and his inner core that it's time to grow up and establish a globally significant design language. So they launched a program called the Snow White competition, in which they sought out half a dozen of the world's leading designers, all European, narrowed it down to two, an English group called BAB, which created a series of prototypes. The computer is Snow White, and then 7 dwarf-like peripherals around it. And a small firm in the Black Forest, then called Esslinger Design, which becomes Frog Design, which created the softer and more approachable off-white language. And we are very much off and running. So this is really the story. It's the migration of a pure technical product, Douglas Engelbart's original interactive computer, from a science fair project almost to a working prototype to a commercial product. And what's significant for our story, this happens within the circumference of an easy bicycle ride. And we could repeat that story with surgical robotics, with electronic gaming, with any number of other artifacts of the valley, each of which will engender a whole new field of design. So, for instance, Atari invents game design. How many game designers do you think Nolan Bushnell hired in 1970 when he's getting this company off the ground? The answer, 0. Why? There was no such thing. He was hiring software engineers, programmers, computer scientists, drug addicts, comic book writers, anybody he could find who could craft a story in code. 10 years later, he was hiring game designers. A new field had emerged. The same thing will happen then with interaction design, a combo of traditional graphic design, computer science, and we have a new field, and we are seeing this over and over again. So the story then, wrapping up, begins to look something like this in the case of personal computing. This sort of migration, the formation of service companies which are design intensive. And this does not mean that they all get on buses and go to the beach, but rather they start to carve off their own smaller companies. And where we are today, which I find simply extraordinary, is the last stage of my story, which is the expansion of the range of problems that designers are now, in a sense, authorized to work on. So moving from packaging electronics to dealing with problems of global poverty, of public health access, of design education, of ethical problems, often under the name, the highly controversial name of design thinking, but it is in many respects the conclusion of a story that goes back 65 years. So that's kind of where we are now. Design has not been supplanted by design thinking, whatever we try to tell you at Stanford. But we have built into our consciousness, in a sense, the idea that the methods and methodologies and strategies of the designer, this toolkit that we've been building for half a century, some of those tools can be applied to pretty much any problem that you can think of. So thank you for your attention there. I will conclude with the original, this is actually the awesome button, as it was then called by a small startup on University Avenue called The Facebook, which a guy named Solaio Cuervo was asked if he could improve the upward pointing thumb and redrew this 16 by 16 pixel image that was in an ugly shade of green, and it turned into the one of the most widely recognized symbols in the world. So I'll conclude on that note. I hope you liked what you heard. And if you read the book, I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope I did not talk too long, but I think we have some 10 minutes for any questions or comments, and I am particularly interested in hearing from the perspective of Googlers how well this sounds and whether it corresponds in any way to your own experience here. Please.
So what do you think is the future of design agencies? At the beginning of your talk, you showed how designers, both designers, migrated to larger companies, a lot of acquisitions by big companies of design agencies. I think part of that is in the last decade, a lot of agencies have really sold design as a strategic asset, and companies have realized if they want to take advantage of that, they need to bring that in-house. So how do you see that trend playing out for agencies?
It's a very, very good question. I don't like to make predictions because I'm wrong about everything that I've ever... I'm a historian, so I'm good at looking backwards. Having said that, I'll make a couple of predictions. One of which is, one of the things that we are seeing, and it's a little bit alarming, is kind of a tightening of the pipeline within many of the independent consultancies. As many of the big companies, I referred to Google as a big vacuum cleaner, which is sucking a lot of talent out of the consultancies, some of which are sitting in this room at this moment. You may be one, I don't know. Okay. And that is unlikely to abate. So, in a sense, it's very good news for the design community. It may be problematic for the independent consultancies. The effect on the consultancies is, in part, they are exploring how the skills that they have acquired over their various histories can be expanded and diversified and applied in different directions. And I think that is actually one of the drivers of this whole design thinking movement. A second thing is somewhat, I would say actually somewhat ominous, which is that there are a lot of organizations which don't have much of a product history, banks, financial services, foundations, governmental organizations, which have been hearing the buzz about design thinking and will send some of their execs to do a program in design thinking or get a certificate in it or whatever, and then are building an internal design thinking team within their bank or within their insurance company or their accounting firm, Deloitte, or whatever. This has been happening. I think you said it. You said with the last decade. I think it's actually even more recent than that. And so we don't yet have a longitudinal database to see how successful this is going to be. One sense that I have is that there are a lot of people who are tacking up their design thinking certificates on the walls of their cool new studios, and within a few weeks, the post-it notes are beginning to flutter down, and they're not quite sure what to do. So one of the things that is telling me is that there is a very significant difference between thinking like a designer and being a designer. And it's not that one is better than the other, but they are very different, and companies, organizations have to be very clear about what they are getting and what they are not getting. I think that a design thinking sensibility is wonderful if it gives people a sense of when you need to hire a real designer and when you need to engage that kind of professional service. So it is one thing to prototype a product concept in a bank, in the cool studio somewhere. But I can tell you, because I teach in a design school, we'll have one of our second-year industrial design students come in. We'll give them an assignment. We want you to do a ballpoint pen. I just made that up. And the kid comes in with a concept, and we say, okay, that's great. Come back next Thursday with 100 iterations of it. And they're never going to do that in the design thinking SWAT squad within an organization. So there is a place for this design as a strategic asset, and there's clearly a place for the deep professional skills that are very, very hard won over the course of a serious design education. I hope that speaks to your kind of question. Yeah, please.
How could one be an engineer with taste?
An engineer with taste. I don't. Yeah, the question is, how can somebody become an engineer with taste? Boy, are you an engineer who is seeking to? That was a phrase that I used in connection with. I guess Harold Lindsay was employee 2 at Ampex way back in the 50s. And he did have this just impeccable sense of beauty, symmetry, finish, and he never wanted any of their recording machines to leave his scrutiny that wasn't perfect. Employee 1 at Ampex, by the way, I'm avoiding your question, but I'll try to get back to it, was a guy named Myron Stolaroff. And I got to tell you this story in case you don't know about him. In much of the universe, we have the technical engineering community off to this side, and they're sitting in cubicles doing problem sets and coding and whatever. And then you have the drug, music, arts people off on this side. In much of Silicon Valley, they were the same person and still are. And there's a little bit of a legacy of that. Myron Stolaroff was a very, very highly trained electrical engineer and the first employee at Ampex in 1949, I think. He has also consumed, so far as we know, more LSD than any other human being on the planet Earth. And he was in the habit, and maybe this will answer your question, I don't know. But he was dealing with this problem that, you know, we now call the problem of a disruptive technology, that you're trained to think in one paradigm and according to one mental framework, and that was, you know, for him, it was pressing wax discs to make music recordings. And the whole technology paradigm had shifted to, you know, this idea that you can embed sound in iron particles embedded in magnetic tape. And his engineers were trained to think one way, and they were being asked to think completely out of the box. How are we going to do that? So he was in the habit of packing up 3 or 4 of his senior engineers into the back of his station wagon every weekend and driving them out to his summer house in the Sierras and filling them full of LSD in 1950, 51. He lost a few of them. And you know, others such as Ray Dolby went on to do some fairly significant work. So I'm not going to go on record as suggesting that that you go that route, although I know a fair number of people now who are reviving an interest in that particular phenomenon. I think probably my serious answer to that is it's not taking a course with Barry Katz at Stanford or anything like that. It's probably by recognizing that most creative work now happens in teams. And what I've seen, especially at IDEO, it used to be that you would see a bunch of people sitting around a table and you'd say, which one is the designer? So here's the designer and here's the double E. Thomas, are you still here? And here's somebody from the manufacturing side. And now we're increasingly thinking of a design team. Almost an undifferentiated group in which people have different competencies, but they are approaching their projects as a kind of an integrated design problem. And there's got to be something there about absorbing some of the skills and mindsets of people with very different sorts of training that may or may not lead you in that direction. It's a nice question. I will meditate further. I think we have time for, yeah, please.
The coalescing of design research from a lot of different perspectives, maybe interdisciplinary disciplines coming together, and where you see that kind of going down the line.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. It was about the coalescing of design research. So one of the ways that I think about it, it was one of those 3 questions that I asked. It was sort of embedded in that, and I don't really think I unpacked it with much clarity in the talk. But in the course of certainly the 65-year history that I have looked at, one of the really striking features of that history is the expansion of the perimeter around what we call design and who we need to be part of that process and what skills we need to be acquiring. So, you know, I often like to tell the story. It's very much an IDEO story, but I think it will resonate here. That the company started in about 1980 with a rather unusual combination of industrial design and mechanical engineering. And a decade later, they began to build a social science competence into that with the hiring of a woman named Jane Fulton Suri, who has a background both in psychology and architecture, which have an unpredictable points of collision there. Why bring in a consultant afterwards to figure out what was wrong with this machine such that a guy just chopped off his finger on it? Why don't you look at it before the accident happened? And so that began a process of adding social psychologists, anthropologists, ethnographers. I have a friend there who is a PhD in behavioral economics. So we're seeing the expansion of the perimeter around what is necessary to approach the insane complexity of what may seem like an extremely simple product. And I see that, I hope this speaks to your question, I see that as only expanding. I mean, I think we are continuing to ask what new competence do we need to build in order to grapple with that. So I'm hearing about sociologists at Google, and I'm hearing about writers being employed in various companies, not simply to document a story of a project after it's completed, but to use narrative strategies to drive a story forward from the outset. So I think that's really, it's a wonderful question, but a very much open-minded one, open-ended one, and I hope open-minded as well.
Thank you so much, Barry. We're at time, but if you can stay and ask your
Happy to.
question after we officially end the event. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.